Well, shalom, all of you. Good to be with you. Nathan and I would like to begin this morning with a song, a very pretty song. Mother bird who protects her young in the shadow of his wings. Well, I've known one of your favorite professors since she was in undergrad school at Cornell University in 1971, Elaine Phillips. Isn't she wonderful? Isn't she the best? Elaine Phillips was just going out with Perry in those days, and we knew each other way back. But, life has a way of teaching you many things, and over the years, I've learned a few things. Being the rabbi of our synagogue for 28 years, you learn many things. And I want to impart to you this morning something of a vision for a very exciting dynamic which is occurring in our world regarding the relationship of the Jewish people and the nations, or particularly the church, and how we've come to understand that relationship is to be expressed. And it's all very, very exciting. But it all began for me in 1971. That was the hippie era. You've learned about that in ancient history, undoubtedly. And in the hippie era, there was the Vietnam War, and America was it was a very tumultuous time in American history. But also around that time, a little bit earlier, 1967, there was what was known as the Six-Day War in Israel, and that was when 5 Arab armies attacked Israel, thinking that they would just wipe us out. Actually, were intending to attack. I'm referring to an earlier war where the 5 armies attacked. That was 1948. But in 1967, there were war drums beating in Damascus and in other places, in Cairo and other places. And Israel launched a preemptive attack, actually, at that point, and managed to defeat all these armies. It was an amazing time, but it was at that time that many young Jewish people who had been assimilating into the general culture began to realize, wow, we could have been wiped out. It could have been all over. I mean, Hitler could have gotten his posthumous victory over us. And it was a time of a growth in a sense of awareness of this unique identity for Jewish people as being connected to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob so long ago, and having this incredible experience through the vicissitudes of history, and here we were in 1967. Well, another dynamic occurring around that time was the Jesus movement. And that was a very exciting time when thousands and thousands of young people, including a large number of Jewish young people, were coming to Jesus. We refer to him as Yeshua, his Hebrew name, but we're coming to Yeshua. And these two impulses coalesced around that time to produce the modern Messianic Jewish movement. And I want to tell you what that's all about, what it is and what it's not, and then tie it in with Romans 11 and hopefully leave you with an encouraging sense of God's presence in our world and what he is doing if we have the eyes to see it. And so at that time, there were many of us, and I was part of this general group at this Jesus Revolution post-Six-Day War group. We were asking ourselves the question, Jesus was Jewish, and as we study the Bible, we saw that he lived in Jewish space in Israel, and he would have eaten Jewish food, and he would have conducted himself according to the normal patterns of Jewish life insofar as they had been normalized at that point of history. And we came to understand, as you read the Gospels, when you read these discussions between him and Pharisees, we found that it was more in-house discussion and debate than a kind of polemic of a church against a Messiah or a Messiah and against his antagonists, and that interpretation of the greater hostility was kind of projected onto our understanding of the text through history. But in reality, we're talking about in-house discussions, in-house debates about halakha, about normative Jewish life and all. Now, of course, as his ministry continued, antagonism with a smaller subset of the Jewish community did increase, and we understand that's absolutely true, principally with the powers in Jerusalem. And so this all resulted in, ultimately, his death. And then Messianic Jews like myself, are convinced that the resurrection of Jesus actually occurred. Had you and I been there hiding in the bushes on that Sunday morning, we would have actually truly witnessed something terribly unusual, unprecedented in human history perhaps, and that would be a dead person who claimed to be this unique individual in Israel actually coming back to life again. And I mention that to you not only because we celebrate it together as an article of faith, but because I believe that faith ultimately has to be rooted in a sense of reality, in a sense of truth, in a sense of objective reality that's bigger than ourselves. And I fear, and this is kind of a parenthetical observation, I fear for a Christian community or a faithful Jewish community that is robbed of a sense of truth that's bigger than ourselves. If truth is just a subjective apprehension of things, then I think we're in trouble. It's very difficult to sustain oneself, particularly during times of persecution and difficulty, if we are not convinced of the objective reality of the verities of the things that we hold on to with all of our hearts. So for Messianic Jews like me, we became convinced that the resurrection had happened, and we began to ask ourselves, what does it mean in 1970 and 1971 and 72? What does it mean to be Jewish, that is, to be of the same line, if you will, as this Messiah, and yet at the same time to be part of a universal community of believers which really spans every people group and every tongue and every nation, etc.? What does it mean in practical terms? How do we live this thing out? And what emerged, as I mentioned earlier, is the modern Messianic Jewish movement. Now, let me tell you what Messianic Judaism, as we represented it at our synagogue, Ruach Israel, and among many synagogues around the country and the world, mean by the term. We do not mean by Messianic Judaism that we have a more sophisticated, more culturally sensitive means of convincing Jewish people that they should join the universal communion of faith, and thereby their Jewishness becomes an option, something no more or less important than a person from an Aboriginal society holding on to their traditions, or an Englishman loving his culture, or a Frenchman, or any other people group. Missiology has become sophisticated to the point of recognizing that celebrating the various cultural expressions of peoples from around the world is a good and worthy thing, and it's possible to pour one's faith into that mold, and to that we would say a hearty amen. But when it comes to Jewish identity, there is something different operating, which I want to mention to you, and it's very important for us to ponder this as we consider what God is doing in our world. Because the Jewish people are in one sense unlike Frenchmen, Eskimos, Italians, and Indians, people from India, wherever. And the difference is this: we believe that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has created this unique covenant, this relationship with the Jewish people, which puts us in a somewhat different category than all of these magnificent cultures from around the world. That is not to say, however, that Jewish people are any better or any worse than anyone else. You're going to find philanthropists in Jerusalem. You're going to find prostitutes in Tel Aviv. You're going to find crooks in Brooklyn. You're going to find the same thing among every people group. All of us are a mixed bag in that sense. But there is something special. There's something unique. And again, as one who's very evidence-oriented, or as one who's oriented toward the objective truth of things, truth outside of ourselves, I look at the fact, and I hope you'll look with me at this, the fact that the Jewish people exist as a recognizable entity, and even back in the land, is an amazing thing. I mean, how many Amalekites do you know? Any Girgashites, you know? These peoples have long passed off the scene, but this community of Jewish people with this self-conscious awareness has continued and does continue. So all of that led us to seek to produce a Messianic Judaism, which was not just a sophisticated missiological technique, a kind of sophisticated bait and switch, that you play Jewish only insofar as people become believers in Jesus, and then after that you tell them, but really all of that Jewish stuff is just passé, it's not important, what matters is just Jesus, and that's all. That's not the picture. You see, Messianic Jews of the type that I represent, and it is a broad spectrum, I will have to admit that, but a growing segment of the Messianic Jewish world understands that there's something about our obligation to Torah, to God's principles for us, to this identity which has been cultivated over centuries, which is not just like the natural ebb and flow of various cultures and the amalgamation of those cultures into others. There is something unique, something special, something which is God ordained. And if you have the eyes to see it, allow it to be a great encouragement to you, because you know and I know that we live in an incredibly confusing age, and I would not call this period of world history the most optimistic period. Would you agree with me on that? It's not. Now, you as young people need to be filled with hope and optimism about the future, and far be it from me to rob you of that sense of excitement about getting out there into the world and finding someone to love and perhaps having children and a career and all that kind of stuff. Go for it. That is your privilege before God, to just do your thing. But at the same time, during our more lucid moments, we know that it is a period of confusion and difficulty. And I want to suggest to you that the great thing that Gordon College has that Harvard doesn't, nor does MIT, is a collective consciousness and an awareness that at the end of the day there is a covenant-keeping God who promises to make things okay in this world one day through his junior partners, us, in this world. But at the end of the day, it is not just a throwing of the dice. It is not just a chance kind of thing, but God will bring good in this world one day. Can you say a hearty amen to that one? Be happy about that, gang. That is the best news that you could possibly, because then all of the vicissitudes, ups and downs, and challenges of life can take their proper proportion, and you can find yourself happy and joyful, courageous, sacrificial, and living great and meaningful lives because your life is hidden in the shadow of his wings. And see, that sense of covenantal reality really, for us as Messianic Jews, looking at the big picture, is a function of what we observe about his relationship to Israel and the nations. His covenantal relationship. And so let me turn to that briefly, and let me talk about how we fit together. How does it all work? See, Messianic Jews, on the one hand, I count us to be in an amazing, privileged position to understand that when that tomb on that Sunday morning truly was empty, and that the Messiah rose from the dead, and the implications of that touch Israel, not just the nations. I know there were some theologians who would say, well, all of that happened for the peoples of the world, that they would turn away from Thor and from the various pagan deities, but as far as the Jewish people are concerned, that it's a non-issue. His Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua, his work is hermetically sealed off from Jewish life, and the reason for that sensibility has to do with Christian anti-Semitism and blah, blah, blah. But I want to tell you, I think it's an intellectually untenable position. If he rose from the dead, then it's very likely that other things that are predicated about him are likely true as well. If the New Testament documents are not just midrashim, or stories by the later community to retrospectively kind of try and figure out what he was like, if in fact there's good reason to believe that that genre of gospel, that literary genre, is historical in its core, and I believe it is, I hope you do too, then it's impossible to separate Jesus from his people. So it's an amazingly privileged position for me to be related to God as part of this unique people, and yet additionally to know the Messiah. It's a phenomenal privilege, and yet it is an incredibly perplexing identity, because we find ourselves between two historically antagonistic religious traditions, and so we spend much of our energy trying to figure out what is the relationship, how do we fit, and how do we fit all together. And what we've come up with has been described by my favorite theologian, Dr. Mark Kinzer. We have some of his books with you, Messianic Jewish theologian, as bilateral ecclesiology. That's a big term, and if you're not into big terms, let me just give you in plain English what that means. It means that the ecclesia, the people of God, the church, the community of God's called out ones, has two wings. It has a Jewish wing and it has a non-Jewish wing. Both are to live in a relationship of mutual blessing, but both are to maintain their distinctiveness as a matter of covenantal fidelity. For you to think that you will get closer to God, I'm speaking to you assuming the majority of you aren't Jewish, for you to believe that you, to get closer to God, have to do Jewish things is wrong. That is not correct. Yes, be aware of your Jewish roots. Great. I'm all for that. We'll help you. But if God made you as part of his polyglot community of denominations and expressions of his faith, of faith in the Messiah as properly expressed among the nations of the world, that's where you need to be. The church is a holy thing, and the Gentile wing is holy, and it bothers me when some Jewish believers get up and either imply or explicitly state that it's fine to be Presbyterian, it's fine to be Baptist, but if you really wanted to do it right, you should dance the hora. And that is not true. God made you who you are. The beauty of the body of Messiah is this relationship of mutual blessing, this bilateral ecclesiology, where we as Jews, covenantally obligated to live according to the unfolding tradition and reality that God gave us, rooted ultimately in Scripture. But as it unfolds in the living expression and living tradition of a people over centuries, that's our thing. That's what we're called to. And the details we wrangle about and wrestle about, as you can imagine. On the other side of the equation, you are called to be who you are. But together, we're called to love one another in this relationship of mutual blessing. And see, It's an encouraging thought, because this is what God is doing in the world today. He is giving non-Jewish believers all over the world, and I can get into great detail about this, a Jewish sensibility, a sense that ultimately your roots are not Wittenberg, Germany, or Rome, or Constantinople, but Jerusalem. And the theological anti-Semitism of the past is evaporating in some quarters, and we see it more and more. And then on the other hand, he's raised up the Messianic Jewish movement, which is growing in maturity and goodness, and bringing us together. And I believe the angels are watching and clapping and saying, yeah, God's promises are being fulfilled. You see, amidst the darkness, which we find in all kinds of quarters, whether it's the military-industrial complex or whatever quarter you happen to see it, there is darkness. But be aware that God is doing his thing. He's calling people from the nations to love the risen Messiah. He's calling Israel to love the risen Messiah. He is giving Messianic Jews like me opportunities to connect among our own people at levels that we never have before, because we are increasingly perceived, and rightly so, to be insiders to this very broad Jewish community that exists nowadays. And people are responding to us in ways that we never have. I'll invite you to a concert. The Moshav Band, it's an internationally known Jewish group, coming to Ruach, Israel on December 6th. Unheard of. This is not a Messianic Jewish group. This is a mainstream group. They're helping us raise money for our Torah by coming to our synagogue. 20 years ago, absolutely impossible. You see, the Jewish community is changing. We've been invited to be part of a non-denominational Jewish camp, a summer camp. They're renting us space so we can have our camp on the same property, share the kosher kitchen with their kids. Unprecedented. Do you think God's up to something? He sure is. Because one day, a tipping point will be reached when the Jewish community will recognize that it is not anti-Jewish, it is not necessarily anti-Jewish, it is not necessarily religious and cultural suicide to believe in the risen one. But in fact, he is the greater Joseph that we hadn't recognized to this point for whatever reasons. He is truly the king. And the true ecumenism, to pronounce it more properly, is going to occur when, under the banner of the Messiah, this bilateral ecclesiology works itself out as Jewish people continuing in the covenant that God gave us, and Gentiles in the covenant that God has given you to love the Jewish Messiah, to love him as your own, and to express yourself on your own terms, within your own frameworks. And when we come together in peace and goodness, and one day the king will sit in his throne, and there are various eschatological frameworks. I tend to be a little bit more of a literalist on this. It's not, you discuss this with your own professors, but I would expect that one day from the actual Jerusalem, it's hard to imagine given the current climate, but one day the Messiah will reign from Jerusalem, and there will be peace and goodness in this world, and no more bad news on the radio about murders and rapes and killings and abused kids, and no more children crying themselves to sleep at night because mommy and daddy are fighting downstairs. Those days will be gone because the Messiah will reign. And so, be encouraged. Be encouraged about God's work in your midst. If undoubtedly at the age that you are, you'll have questions about your faith, don't bury them, ask them, and continue on. I hope you'll all continue on loving God with all your hearts, understanding the Messiah in all of his manifold glory. And I hope many of you too will become friends of the Jewish people and be friends of the Messianic Jewish community as well. Nathan, as my understudy, the intern at Ruach Israel, is a graduate student at Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, which is our graduate institution for training Messianic Jewish leaders. Some of you may be Jewish. If you are, in particular, come and see us. We'd love to meet you and let you know about what graduate study, after you're done here at Gordon, could look like in a Messianic Jewish context, if you've been at all attracted to the things I've been talking about today. But we need to finish up, and so we are going to play you a song. Now, you see, in the olden days, I was a music major at college. Nathan just finished up at New England Conservatory of Music, and so this is a hand clapper This is if it's culturally acceptable in this assembly, a dance number. Don't faint. And it's called Hava Nagila. Okay? So why don't we all get up and we're going to play you a little bit of Hava Nagila. Who goes first? I start? Okay. Yeah. Shalom, everyone. Be well.